Hey guys, welcome back, or welcome for the first time, to tonight's very calm little history ramble. If you're here, I'm guessing you're already in bed, lights down, phone brightness turned way, way down, and probably fighting the urge to check your notifications one last time. Don't worry, they'll be there in the morning. Tonight is not about emails or chores. Tonight we're heading back a few thousand years into the desert where some very ambitious pharaohs decided that the best way to spend their unlimited power and their people's free time was stacking rocks, very big rocks, for decades. Yes, we're talking about the Great Pyramids of Egypt, those giant stone triangles that everyone knows but no one really understands. Built thousands of years ago, still standing while most modern buildings crumble after a few decades. And the funny thing is, for all our technology, for all our satellites and laser scans and "we're so smart now" attitude, we still don't actually know every detail of how they were built. Which means you get to close your eyes, listen, and picture a lot of sweaty ancient Egyptians dragging limestone blocks while their pharaoh sits in the shade, probably being fanned by servants and muttering things like, "Yes, higher. No, taller. Bigger than my dad's pyramid, obviously." So, let's glide back to around 2600 BCE. This is Old Kingdom Egypt. It's hot, it's sandy, and it's run by kings who thought they were gods. Literally gods. Imagine a politician today not just asking for your vote, but for your eternal worship. Pharaohs didn't campaign, they commanded. And their number one priority? Making sure that when they eventually keeled over, their tomb was basically a VIP lounge for the afterlife. Now, before pyramids, Egypt's royals were buried in what were called mastabas, which were not very pyramid-like, more like big, flat rectangles of mud brick. They worked fine, but of course someone decided flat rectangles were just too humble. Enter Pharaoh Djoser. Djoser said, I'd like something a little taller, a little flashier. Let's stack some mastabas on top of each other like a very boring wedding cake." And just like that, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara was born. This was the first pyramid-shaped thing in history. It looked like stairs because, well, it literally was stairs. And the genius behind it? An architect named Imhotep. Yes, that Imhotep. Later turned into a weird villain in the Mummy movies. But in real life, he was more like the Steve Jobs of ancient Egypt. Smart, innovative, loved geometry. Imhotep basically invented stone architecture in Egypt, which was a pretty big deal, considering everyone else was still messing around with mud bricks that fell apart every time it rained. But let's float forward, because the real drama, the real stone flexing, came later with the Fourth Dynasty. This is where we get to the Great Pyramids at Giza. You've seen them in a million documentaries, postcards, or probably as a random desktop wallpaper when you first got your computer in 2006. 3 giant pyramids lined up dramatically on the edge of the desert. They've been standing there for over 4,000 years while empires rose and fell, while Alexander the Great rolled through, while Napoleon supposedly looked up at them and told his soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you, which was probably his way of saying, stop complaining about the heat, you're not special. So who actually ordered these monster structures? 3 kings. Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, father, son, and grandson, which means, yes, the Great Pyramids were basically one very elaborate family rivalry. Let's start with Khufu, also known to the Greeks as Cheops. If you've ever seen the Great Pyramid, that's his. The biggest, the boldest, the "look at me, I'm king of everything" kind of pyramid. Standing originally at 481 feet tall, built out of around 2.3 million stone blocks, which is absurd. That's like telling your people, hey, I want you to build me a mountain, but don't use nature, just carry blocks that weigh a few tons each, one at a time, and stack them until I'm satisfied. Now, if you're wondering what Khufu was like as a person, well, ancient sources don't paint him in a very flattering light. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing centuries later, described him as a cruel tyrant who closed all the temples, forced everyone into slavery, and basically ran Egypt like a cranky old landlord. But the thing is, Herodotus was writing long after Khufu was dead, which means it's entirely possible he was just recycling gossip, because people love to trash talk dead kings. And let's be honest, if you're the guy who builds the world's largest tomb for yourself, people are going to call you arrogant whether you deserve it or not. Either way, Khufu wasn't remembered as Khufu the kind-hearted. He was remembered as Khufu, the guy with the really, really big pyramid, which in pharaonic terms is probably exactly what he wanted. His afterlife Yelp review was 5 stars in stonemasonry, 1 star in customer service. Now, the Great Pyramid itself, let's slow down and imagine it. Huge limestone blocks, stacked with eerie precision, covering an area of 13 acres. Inside, narrow passageways, strange chambers, shafts pointing at the stars. And to this day, we still don't know all the secrets hidden inside. In fact, just a few years ago, scientists used muon scans, basically cosmic ray X-rays for giant rocks, and discovered there might be hidden voids, secret chambers still tucked away inside Khufu's pyramid, which is kind of wild considering it's been standing there for 45 centuries. And we're still saying, maybe there's a whole room we missed. And then there's the mystery of how it was built. People love to imagine alien forklifts or advanced lost technologies or some secret ancient crane system. The truth is probably less flashy. Ramps. Lots and lots of ramps. Straight ramps, zigzag ramps, spiraling ramps. Egyptians were really good at ropes, sledges, and teamwork, and also at not giving their workers much of a choice in the matter. Though, to be fair, recent archaeology suggests they weren't all miserable slaves. Many were skilled laborers who got decent food, housing, and probably a lifetime of back pain. But let's not get lost in the engineering, because the people behind these pyramids are honestly funnier than the pyramids themselves. After Khufu, along comes his son, Khafre. And Khafre clearly looked at Dad's pyramid and thought, yeah, I'll do that too. His pyramid is slightly smaller, but still massive. And to make up for the size difference, he threw in the Sphinx. You know, the giant lion statue with the human face that looks suspiciously like it's been through a sandblasting incident. The Sphinx has stared blankly at the desert for thousands of years, its nose long gone, its smile frozen in eternal judgment. People have argued forever about whose face it's supposed to be, but the general consensus is that it's Khafre, which means, yes, he gave himself a 240-foot-long lion body as a statue, because why not? If you can't be taller than Dad's pyramid, just sculpt yourself into a mythological creature instead. That'll show him. Khafre also had a reputation for being, not exactly nice. Ancient sources claimed he was just as ruthless as Khufu, if not worse, which honestly might just be standard pharaoh PR at this point. It's like every time someone wrote history, they couldn't resist adding, oh, and by the way, he was also kind of a jerk. And then, rounding out this little family dynasty, we have Menkaure, Khafre's son. Now, Menkaure went for a pyramid that was noticeably smaller, only about 200 feet tall, which makes him seem like the underachiever of the group. But ancient sources actually described him as kinder, more generous, less obsessed with being intimidating. Apparently, people actually liked him, which of course meant his pyramid ended up half the size, because in history, the nice guys rarely get the biggest monuments. But still, Menkaure's pyramid is unique. It was partly covered in granite instead of just limestone, giving it a slightly fancier look. But even that didn't save it from later pharaohs or grave robbers. By the time archaeologists got to it, the interior was basically ransacked. Welcome to the eternal problem of being a pharaoh. You spend decades building a house for your dead body, only for someone centuries later to break in and say, "Cool treasure, mine now." So let's drift for a moment, because that's really the secret of the pyramids. They weren't just tombs. They were propaganda in stone, giant symbols meant to scream, "I am eternal, I am divine, I am richer than you could ever imagine." And yet, despite all the effort, almost every pyramid was robbed within a few hundred years. Which is kind of the most ironic historical punchline imaginable. You order the world's biggest tomb to protect your stuff, and all it does is advertise, "Hey robbers, the good loot's in here." So tonight, as you settle deeper into your pillow, think of Khufu staring proudly at his Great Pyramid, convinced he had beaten time itself. And then picture some ancient grave robber sneaking in with a chisel and saying, "Thanks, Pharaoh, this'll fetch a good price." But let's not stop at the pyramids themselves, because the kings who built them lived in a world that was every bit as strange, petty, and dysfunctional as later royal courts. And honestly, that's where the really fun, sleepy history gossip begins.
So we've set the stage. You're picturing the Great Pyramids, glowing under the moonlight, sitting smugly in the desert like giant granite flexes. But as with all things in history, the stones aren't really the point. It's the people behind them. And in Egypt's case, that means kings who thought they were gods, queens who sometimes ran the show from the shadows, and families that redefined the word dysfunctional. Let's ease into that world. The Old Kingdom, when the pyramids were being built, is sometimes called the Age of the Pyramids, which is neat branding, but it was also the age of pharaohs behaving badly. Because when you grow up being told you're literally divine, your ego doesn't exactly stay humble. Pharaohs weren't just kings. They were seen as the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, which meant, in theory, they were wise, just, and semi-immortal. In practice, they were moody, paranoid, and obsessed with making sure their tombs had enough shiny stuff in them. Take Khufu again. We already said he wasn't remembered as warm and cuddly, but let's talk about how his people actually viewed him. Imagine being an Egyptian farmer, dragged away from your fields to go move limestone blocks for 20 years. Every sunrise, the same sun-baked shift, dragging a sled while some overseer yells at you to pull harder, the God King demands it. You'd probably start to resent your divine leader, which might explain why, centuries later, Egyptians themselves remembered Khufu as a bit of a tyrant. Not just the Greeks throwing shade, even his own people kind of agreed. There's an old Egyptian tale called the Westcar Papyrus, written long after Khufu's time, but featuring him as a character. And in it, he's portrayed as, well, kind of an entitled jerk who sits around being entertained with magic tricks, which sounds harmless enough, but the story makes it clear he was more interested in distracting himself than actually governing. So, even in ancient bedtime stories, Khufu was already being roasted. Now, slide your mind over to Khafra, his son. We said his pyramid was almost as big, and he probably gave us the Sphinx. But his reign wasn't all majestic statues. Khafra was remembered, again mostly through later gossip, as doubling down on the whole divine tyrant act. According to some accounts, he continued closing temples, restricted freedoms, and basically reminded everyone daily, yes, my father may have been hated, but don't worry, I'm just as bad. Which raises the question, why did this dynasty last so long if everyone despised them? The answer? Divine branding. When the state religion tells you the guy on the throne is literally a god, rebellion doesn't sound like a smart career move. But don't worry, the family had its quirks too. Pharaohs didn't just marry anyone. They often married their sisters, or half-sisters, or nieces. Because when you believe your bloodline is divine, you don't want to dilute it with mere mortals. You keep it in the family, even if your family tree starts looking less like a tree and more like a very unfortunate shrub. And yes, this eventually leads to the classic royal inbreeding problems that show up all across history. But in Old Kingdom Egypt, it was simply business as usual. You're the living god, she's your divine sibling. Congratulations, it's a match made in heaven. Now, Menkaure, the grandson in this little trio, is often remembered as the good one. Supposedly kinder, supposedly more generous. Ancient Egyptian sources, or what little survived, painted him as the king who finally cut people some slack, which is adorable until you remember his pyramid is half the size of his dad's. So his kindness may have been less about a big heart and more about having fewer resources. Historians debate whether Egypt was actually running out of money and manpower by his reign, which would make sense, after all. You can't keep building mountains of stone forever without your economy feeling a little drained. But Menkaure did stand out. He also had a queen, Khmer-Nebti II, who's sometimes depicted alongside him in statues. And if you've ever seen those statues, you'll notice something subtle but unusual. She's standing right next to him, almost equal in height, arm wrapped around him. That's rare in Egyptian royal art, where pharaohs usually tower over their wives to show dominance. So either Menkaure really was more respectful, or the sculptor was just feeling bold that day. Either way, their statues look like the closest thing to a power couple in the pyramid era. Of course, life in the palace wasn't all marble statues and loving embraces. Pharaohs had harems, courtiers, and family members constantly plotting for influence. Imagine the drama of any modern royal family, then multiply it by desert heat and divine egos. Siblings married siblings, sons plotted against fathers, uncles schemed behind the throne. The pyramids might look timeless and stable, but behind the walls, it was just a regular royal soap opera with eyeliner. Speaking of eyeliner, let's drift briefly into daily life. We tend to picture Egyptians as endlessly solemn, wrapped in linen, chanting prayers, but in reality, they were people. They had fashion trends, bad hair days, and too much beer at festivals. In fact, beer was the daily drink of choice, cleaner than Nile water, packed with calories, and yes, given to workers at pyramid sites. Some archaeologists think workers were basically paid in bread and beer, which means the Great Pyramid wasn't just built on limestone, it was built on carbs. And while we're here, let's talk about the workers again. Forget the Hollywood image of whips and chains. Sure, there was harsh labor, but evidence suggests the pyramid builders lived in organized villages, with bakeries, breweries, and even medical care. Excavations found bones showing healed injuries, meaning workers were treated, not just discarded. So it makes the whole enterprise sound less like a death camp and more like the world's longest, hardest government job. You didn't get vacation days, but at least you got bread, beer, and a bandage if you broke your leg. Still, for all the resources poured into these projects, the irony remains: not a single pharaoh's body has been found inside the Great Pyramids. Grave robbers, erosion, or maybe just ancient clerical errors, whatever the reason, the pyramids ended up as empty husks. Which makes you wonder if Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure would be proud of their eternal monuments, or just really annoyed that someone stole the furniture. Now, let's take a slow step sideways, because pyramids weren't just about the kings. They were also about religion. The shape itself, that sharp triangular slope, symbolized the sun's rays, a staircase to the heavens. The whole structure was meant to channel the king's soul up into the sky to merge with the sun god Ra, which is poetic if you don't think too hard about the logistics. Imagine spending your entire life building a pyramid, also one guy's soul can use it as a personal launchpad. And while we're floating on that thought, remember, ancient Egypt wasn't timeless. The Old Kingdom eventually collapsed. Droughts, famines, political breakdowns. The pyramids stood tall, but the government behind them fell apart, which is almost the ultimate bedtime metaphor. All human ambition eventually crumbles, but the rocks we stack in the desert might outlast us all. Of course, in the centuries that followed, people kept trying to copy the pyramid idea, but none were as grand as Khufu's. Later pyramids were smaller, sloppier, and often fell apart, which is a little embarrassing. Imagine being the great-great-grandson of the guy who built the Great Pyramid, and your version looks like a lopsided sandcastle. Not the kind of thing you want in your divine resume. And yet, the obsession with monumental tombs never stopped. Even when pyramids faded out, Egyptians built huge temples, elaborate Valley of the King's tombs, and giant statues of themselves. Because apparently, being remembered was more important than ruling wisely. A pattern we've seen again and again in history. When in doubt, build something tall and put your name on it. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember, behind every stone block was a worker with sore muscles. Behind every grand design was an ego in royal sandals. And behind every pyramid was a family of kings trying desperately to outdo each other in the art of being remembered. And of course, we're only scratching the surface, because if we wander just a little deeper into Egyptian history, past the Pyramid Age, past the Old Kingdom, we'll find even stranger kings, weirder queens, and dynasties that make Khufu's family look almost normal. But we'll get there, slowly.
So when we last left off, the Old Kingdom was collapsing. Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, their giant pyramids still loomed on the desert horizon, but their government had kind of fallen apart. Turns out you can't just keep dragging giant rocks forever and expect society to run smoothly. Egypt slipped into what historians blandly call the First Intermediate Period, which translated into normal language means everything went wrong. Crops failed, regional governors started acting like mini-kings, and pharaohs suddenly weren't as convincing when they said, "I'm the divine ruler of all things." Because when people are starving, the divine ruler looks less like a god and more like a guy hoarding the last loaf of bread. So yes, chaos. The central government collapsed, rival dynasties squabbled, local warlords did their thing. Imagine the Egyptian version of medieval feudalism, but with more sand. But because Egyptian history runs on cycles like a badly scripted soap opera, eventually order was restored. Enter the Middle Kingdom, around 2050 BCE. A new dynasty, led by Mentuhotep II, pulled things back together. His great achievement? Unifying Egypt again, which sounds impressive but was probably less about brilliant diplomacy and more about beating up enough rivals until everyone agreed to listen. Mentuhotep built himself a flashy tomb too, though not a giant pyramid. By this time, pyramids were a little out of fashion, partly because everyone had seen how badly they got robbed. Nothing kills a trend like realizing your 1,000-year stone investment is just gonna get looted by the time your grandchildren are born. So tombs started getting tucked away in cliffs, disguised, hidden. Subtlety was the new style. And with that, Egyptian kings started shifting their image too. Middle Kingdom pharaohs weren't just distant gods on earth anymore, at least not entirely. They also liked to show themselves as approachable, fatherly, sometimes even vulnerable, which is a wild swing from "I'm literally Horus incarnate" to "look at me, the slightly tired but wise dad of Egypt." Take Pharaoh Senusret III, for example. His statues are famous for showing him with heavy eyelids, drooping cheeks, and a tired, worried expression, which, if you think about it, is almost revolutionary in royal art. Instead of showing himself as eternally young, eternally perfect, he basically said, "Yeah, being pharaoh is exhausting, and I look like I haven't slept in 5 years. Put that in stone." And his sculptors did, which makes Senusret the rare king who might actually have been relatable. Though, of course, he was still a pharaoh, meaning his relatable problems included controlling trade routes and ordering executions. Small details. Now, the Middle Kingdom also saw pharaohs experimenting with new strategies for keeping control. Instead of just flexing with giant monuments, they leaned harder into religion and literature. This was the era when wisdom texts, stories, and poetry flourished, which means, yes, pharaohs were sponsoring bedtime stories long before we got here. The instructions of Amenemhat is basically a royal ghost memo from a murdered king telling his son, "Don't trust anyone, they're all out to get you." Very relaxing parenting advice. But behind the philosophy and pensive statues, the dynasties were still messy. Pharaohs married within the family. Royal mothers especially played powerful roles, sometimes more powerful than the kings themselves. In fact, some historians argue that the Middle Kingdom was basically run by royal mothers behind the throne, which makes sense since pharaohs were often very young when they inherited power, and nothing says eternal God on earth than being bossed around by your mom. Still, the Middle Kingdom wasn't all peace and wisdom scrolls. Egypt had to deal with constant border problems. Nubia in the south, Bedouins in the east, lots of raiders, rebels, and resource fights. Pharaohs built fortresses, launched campaigns, and spent a lot of time trying to remind everyone who was in charge, which meant statues of tired faces weren't just art, they were probably accurate mood boards. But, as always, prosperity doesn't last forever. Around 1700 BCE, the Middle Kingdom crumbled and Egypt entered another messy period, the Second Intermediate Period, which sounds like a sequel nobody asked for. And this time, things got even weirder. Because during this period, Egypt got invaded by outsiders known as the Hyksos. These weren't aliens, despite what certain documentaries on late-night TV want you to believe. The Hyksos were likely Canaanite people from the Levant who took advantage of Egypt's political weakness. They marched in, took control of the northern delta, and ruled for a while, and the Egyptians, for once, had to deal with being the conquered instead of the conquerors, which did not sit well with them. The Hyksos introduced new technologies too, like the horse-drawn chariot. Egyptians hadn't been using those yet, so suddenly they had to play catch-up. Imagine the humiliation. You're the mighty builders of pyramids, the rulers of the Nile, and then some neighbors show up with flashy new horse carts and wreck your army. Not a good look. So yes, catch up. Eventually, Egypt rallied. A southern dynasty rose in Thebes, pushed back against the Hyksos, and kicked them out. And with that, Egypt entered what's called the New Kingdom, the golden age of pharaohs, the era of big names like Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Ramses II, basically the celebrities of Egyptian history. But before we rush there, let's pause and look at what all this means. From pyramids to vulnerable sculptures to foreign invasions, what we're really seeing is Egypt cycling through phases of ego, humility, and recovery. Kings go from "I'm eternal" to "I'm exhausted" to "oops, we lost to the neighbors," and back again. Which, if nothing else, makes them feel a little more human. Now, let's drift into the New Kingdom. And oh boy, this is where things get entertaining. The New Kingdom is like Egypt turned up to 11. Bigger temples, bolder personalities, stranger religious experiments, and of course, even more royal family dysfunction. Because if there's one thing Egyptian history never runs out of, it's divine egos in awkward marriages. We'll start with Hatshepsut. She's one of the most famous female pharaohs, ruling around 1470 BCE. Officially, she was supposed to just be regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III. But Hatshepsut looked at the situation and thought, why stop at babysitting? I think I'll just run Egypt myself. And she did. She declared herself pharaoh, wore the royal regalia, and even had herself depicted in statues with a ceremonial beard. Because in ancient Egypt, nothing said authority like a fake chin wig. And honestly, she was good at it. Hatshepsut's reign was prosperous, filled with trade expeditions and temple building. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri is still one of the most beautiful in Egypt. But of course, her stepson wasn't thrilled about being sidelined. When Thutmose III finally grew up and took the throne, he spent years trying to erase Hatshepsut's memory, chiseling her name off monuments, smashing statues, which, ironically, just made her even more famous later. Nothing says "I mattered" than someone going out of their way to delete you from history. Next we have Akhenaten. And if you thought pharaohs were eccentric before, buckle up. Akhenaten decided to change Egypt's entire religion. For centuries, Egyptians had worshipped a whole pantheon of gods: Ra, Osiris, Isis, you name it. But Akhenaten said, nope, forget all that. From now on, we're all worshipping just one god, Aten, the sun disk, basically inventing monotheism in Egypt. He even moved the capital to a brand new city, Amarna, dedicated to Aten. He changed the art style too. Instead of stiff, idealized figures, he had himself portrayed with a weird, elongated head, spindly limbs, and a potbelly. Some think it was a new artistic freedom, others think he just looked like that. Either way, Akhenaten rebranded himself as the ultimate weirdo pharaoh. And then there's his son, Tutankhamun. Yes, King Tut, the boy king who took the throne around age 9 and died by 19. His reign wasn't especially important, but his tomb was, because it was one of the only royal tombs found mostly intact in modern times. And when Howard Carter opened it in 1922, the world went absolutely nuts. Gold, treasures, masks. Tut became the most famous pharaoh, despite doing almost nothing of note while alive, which is, frankly, the most relatable historical achievement. And finally, we have Ramses II, Ramses the Great. If pharaohs were rock stars, Ramses was Elvis, Mick Jagger, and Beyoncé rolled into one. He ruled for 66 years, built temples everywhere, and carved his name on more monuments than anyone else. He even fought the famous Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, which he declared a glorious victory, even though it was basically a stalemate. Ramses was the ultimate self-promoter. If Instagram had existed, his account would have been intolerable. And yet, for all their grandeur, all their monuments, all their divine pretensions, they were still just humans, inbred.
So here we are, dozing in the golden glow of Egypt's new kingdom. The pyramids are long behind us, replaced by sprawling temples, colossal statues, and pharaohs with a flair for over-the-top self-promotion. If the Old Kingdom was all about stone triangles, the New Kingdom was about stone selfies. And no one perfected the art of the stone selfie quite like Ramses II, Ramses the Great, the pharaoh who said, "If I can't live forever, I'll just make sure my face is everywhere." He ruled for 66 years, which for the ancient world was practically an eternity. Imagine outlasting most of your political enemies simply by stubbornly refusing to die. That was Ramses. By the end, people probably forgot what Egypt was like without him. Ramses didn't just rule, he plastered his name and image across the country. Temples, obelisks, colossal statues, all proudly shouting, Ramses was here. Some weren't even his. He had no shame about chiseling out earlier kings' names and carving in his own. It's like ancient Photoshop, but with a hammer and chisel. His most famous monument? Abu Simbel. 2 enormous seated statues of Ramses, each about 66 feet tall, staring across the Nile like giant stone action figures. The message was clear. Don't forget me, don't even try. And honestly, it worked. Thousands of years later, we're still talking about him. Now, Ramses was also known for the Battle of Kadesh, fought against the Hittites around 1274 BCE. It's one of the earliest battles in history where we have detailed accounts. According to Ramses' inscriptions, it was a glorious Egyptian victory. According to the Hittites, it was also their victory, which basically means it was a draw, but neither side wanted to admit it. Typical. Ramses, being Ramses, had his version carved in temples across Egypt, complete with dramatic illustrations of him charging into battle alone, mowing down enemies like some kind of chariot superhero, which, let's be honest, probably didn't happen. But if you control the narrative, you can make yourself look like the ancient Egyptian Chuck Norris. He also had a famously huge family, dozens of wives, more than 100 children. His favorite queen, Nefertari, got her own stunning temple at Abu Simbel, which is about as good as an ancient Valentine's gift gets. The sheer scale of his offspring meant that by the time Ramses finally died in his 90s, half the royal court was made up of his kids, which, unsurprisingly, caused some messy succession disputes later, because nothing says smooth transition of power than 20 sons all thinking they should be next in line. But Ramses' reign was the high point. After him, things started wobbling. His successors weren't as impressive. They still built temples, still pretended Egypt was at the height of glory, but the truth was cracks were forming. Economically, militarily, politically, the empire was straining under its own weight. By the time we reached the late New Kingdom, Egypt had developed what we might call pharaoh fatigue. Pharaohs came and went. Some ruled for only a year or two. Others tried to cling to Ramses' legacy by naming themselves after him. Ramses III, Ramses IV, Ramses V, all the way up to Ramses XI. It was like a dynasty of tribute bands, each one trying to be Ramses the Great, but never quite pulling it off. Ramses III, for example, did have one major moment, fighting off the Sea Peoples. And no, that's not a bad 80s band name. The Sea Peoples were mysterious raiders who appeared out of nowhere around the 12th century BCE, attacking kingdoms all over the eastern Mediterranean. Nobody knows exactly who they were, possibly displaced groups from multiple regions, but they showed up with ships, weapons, and bad attitudes, and they smashed through kingdoms like a traveling apocalypse. Ramses III faced them head-on, and, according to Egyptian records, won. His inscriptions proudly show the Sea Peoples being slaughtered, their ships capsizing, chaos everywhere. It was one of the last great military victories of Egypt. But even Ramses III couldn't stop the overall decline, because while he might have beaten the Sea Peoples once, the economic strain, invasions, and internal problems just kept piling up. And Ramses III's own family story? Oh, it gets juicy. He was the victim of what's now called the harem conspiracy. Basically, one of his wives, not satisfied with her son's place in the royal succession, plotted to assassinate him. The plot involved magic wax figurines, court officials, and probably way too much gossip whispered behind palace curtains. The assassination succeeded. Ramses III's mummy shows his throat was slit, which means that even the great defender of Egypt, even the last truly powerful Ramses, ended up falling to palace intrigue. After that, it was all downhill. The new kingdom crumbled. Egypt entered yet another intermediate period. This time, instead of building pyramids or grand temples, pharaohs mostly struggled to hold on to any real power at all. Priests of Amun and Thebes became more powerful than the kings. Local governors did their own thing. Foreigners crept in again. Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians. Egypt was still rich in culture and resources, but politically, it was a mess. And when we talk about pharaohs in this later period, the word tragic starts to apply more than great. Many were short-lived rulers, often manipulated by court officials. Some left barely a trace in the archaeological record. Others, desperate to revive Egypt's glory, just made awkward copies of what had already been done better centuries earlier. It's like a band that peaked with its first album and then spent the rest of its career releasing uninspired remixes. One especially sad figure was Pasamidi III, who reigned in the 6th century BCE. He had the misfortune of being the last native pharaoh before Persia conquered Egypt. His reign lasted about 6 months. Imagine finally making it to the throne, only to have the Persian Empire roll in before you've even finished decorating your palace. Not exactly a triumphant career. And yet, despite these failures, Egyptians still clung to the image of pharaohs as divine. Even when foreign powers like Persia, Greece, and Rome took over, they often styled themselves as pharaohs too, just to fit in. Alexander the Great marched into Egypt, founded Alexandria, and let the priests crown him as a pharaoh. He knew good branding when he saw it. Later, the Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty descended from one of Alexander's generals, ruled Egypt for centuries while pretending to be proper Egyptian monarchs, which worked, sort of.
They learned the rituals, married their siblings just like old times, and built temples in traditional styles. And of course, this eventually gave us Cleopatra VII, the Cleopatra. Not the first Cleopatra, there were several before her, all part of the Ptolemaic dynasty's confusing naming tradition. But the famous Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of Egypt, ruling in the 1st century BCE. By then, Egypt was essentially a pawn in the bigger game of Roman politics. Cleopatra tried to keep Egypt independent by aligning herself with powerful Roman men. Julius Caesar, then Mark Antony. But in the end, Octavian, soon to be Augustus, won the Roman Civil War, and Cleopatra lost everything. Her death in 30 BCE marked the end of pharaonic Egypt. After her, Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire. The pyramids and temples still stood, the Nile still flooded each year, but the age of god-kings was gone. From then on, pharaohs lived only in memory, stone, and bedtime stories. And that perhaps is the most poetic part. Because for all the grandeur, all the divine titles, all the sibling marriages and stone propaganda, Egypt's rulers ended the same way as everyone else: mortal, fallible, and eventually forgotten. Their pyramids stood, but their names crumbled. Their treasures dazzled, but only for the robbers who found them. Their dynasties rose and fell, leaving behind ruins that now serve as background scenery for tourists taking selfies. So as you sink deeper into your pillow tonight, picture Ramses' statues at Abu Simbel still staring out over the desert, unblinking. Imagine Cleopatra on her barge, sailing the Nile with silver sails, knowing her dynasty's days were numbered. Imagine Khufu's pyramid looming under the stars, a mountain of stone built just to make one man feel eternal. And remember that in the end, all of it, the pyramids, the temples, the royal dramas, has turned into the quiet hum of history, a lullaby in stone.
So, we've floated past the grandeur of the Old Kingdom pyramids. We've wandered through the sun-drenched drama of Ramses and his temple selfies, and now we arrive at the final act of Egyptian royalty. The Greeks who showed up, unpacked their sandals, and said, "Sure, we'll be pharaohs now." Enter the Ptolemaic dynasty. It all began with Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, at the ripe age of 32, proving even history's rock stars don't live forever, his massive empire got sliced up like a badly shared pizza. Ptolemy grabbed Egypt. Why? Because it was rich, strategically placed, and had a population used to bowing down to god-kings. For an ambitious warlord looking to legitimize himself, Egypt was basically the jackpot. Ptolemy and his descendants ruled Egypt for almost 3 centuries, and in those 3 centuries, they perfected one particular royal skill: dysfunctional family politics. Now, the Ptolemies aren't native Egyptians. They were Greek, Macedonian to be precise. They spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and generally considered themselves far too sophisticated for the local culture. But crucially, they realized Egyptians really loved their pharaohs. So, in a move of political genius, the Ptolemies styled themselves as proper Egyptian kings and queens. They got themselves depicted in traditional pharaonic art, dressed in the old regalia, and nodded politely to the priests. On the walls of temples, you'd see them offering gifts to Horus or Isis. But behind closed doors, they were speaking Greek, eating Greek food, and squabbling like characters from a tragic soap opera. And let's talk about those squabbles. The Ptolemies had one particular habit: marrying their siblings. It wasn't exactly a new idea. The old pharaohs had done it too, but the Ptolemies turned it into a family tradition, like awkward holiday dinners except with crowns and incest.
Ptolemy II married his full sister, Arsinoe II, earning them the nickname Philadelphoi, or sibling lovers. Subtle. And once that precedent was set, generation after generation followed suit. Brother married sister, cousin married cousin, uncles married nieces. It was a family tree that folded in on itself like a badly copied origami swan. Now, was this about romance? Absolutely not. It was about power, keeping the royal bloodline pure, consolidating authority, and making sure no outsiders got a piece of the throne. Which sounds fine in theory, until you realize it created a dynasty where everyone was both your sibling and your potential murderer. And speaking of murder, the Ptolemies loved a good family killing. Assassinations, poisonings, palace coups. It was basically their version of game night. If you thought medieval Europe had messy successions, the Ptolemies said, "Hold my amphora." Take Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Physcon, which translates to potbelly. Not exactly a flattering title for a king, but he earned it. He was infamous for his cruelty and his sheer lack of subtlety. At one point, he had his own nephew murdered on his wedding day, during the feast, and then forced his mother to attend the dismemberment. Relaxing family event, right? He also married his sister, Cleopatra II, then dumped her to marry her daughter, his own niece, Cleopatra III. Yes, he married his wife's daughter. Family dinners must have been tense. And yet, despite all this dysfunction, the Ptolemies kept ruling because Egypt was wealthy, strategically important, and the Mediterranean powers kept cutting deals with whoever had the throne at the moment. The dynasty survived constant coups, shifting alliances, and the occasional civil war, all while keeping up appearances with giant temples and public festivals. Fast forward a bit, and we arrive at the most famous Ptolemy of all, Cleopatra VII, the Cleopatra. Not Cleopatra 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. Yes, there were that many before her. But Cleopatra VII was the one who became legend. Cleopatra was born around 69 BCE into this whirlwind of palace intrigue and family drama. By the time she was 18, she was co-ruling Egypt with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. And of course, because this was the Ptolemies, they were also married. Nothing says happy family business like being forced to wed your preteen sibling. But Cleopatra was different from many of her predecessors. She wasn't just a puppet for advisors or a figurehead for the priests. She was ambitious, intelligent, and multilingual. Unlike most Ptolemies, she actually learned to speak Egyptian in addition to Greek. She knew how to charm, how to manipulate, and how to project authority, which made her both powerful and dangerous. Her relationship with her brother husband deteriorated fast. Factions formed, civil war broke out, and just when things were getting messy, Rome stepped in. Because by this point, Egypt was basically under Roman protection, which is a polite way of saying, you're independent until we decide you're not. And who should arrive in Alexandria but Julius Caesar himself? This was Cleopatra's golden opportunity. She smuggled herself into his quarters, rolled up in a rug. Yes, the famous story, though some versions say it was a laundry sack. Whichever way, it worked. Caesar was charmed. He backed Cleopatra against her brother. Ptolemy XIII ended up drowned in the Nile during the fighting, and Cleopatra was firmly in charge. She also had a child with Caesar, little Caesarion, officially named Ptolemy XV. The name basically screamed, yes, he's Egyptian royalty, but please notice his Roman paternity. For a while, Cleopatra's strategy seemed perfect. Align with Rome's top man, secure Egypt's throne, and keep her dynasty alive. Of course, Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE ruined that plan. Cleopatra then set her sights on another Roman power player, Antony, one of Caesar's top allies. Their relationship became the stuff of legend: lavish feasts, golden barges, endless gossip. Together, they had 3 children and presented themselves as the glamorous power couple of the Eastern Mediterranean. But Rome being Rome, nothing stays stable for long. Antony and Cleopatra faced off against Octavian, Caesar's heir, and in 31 BCE, at the Battle of Actium, their fleet was crushed. A year later, both Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide. Him with a sword, she supposedly with an asp, though historians debate whether it was really poison. Either way, it was a suitably tragic ending.
So, Cleopatra is gone. Her eyeliner fades into legend, her golden barge floats quietly out of sight, and Egypt has been scooped up by Rome like an expensive trinket. We've reached 30 BCE, and Octavian, soon to be Augustus, declares Egypt a Roman province. And here's the thing. For the Romans, Egypt wasn't just another province. It was their breadbasket. The Nile's fertile floods grew grain in obscene quantities, grain that Rome needed. Because if the people of Rome didn't get their bread, they got cranky. And cranky Romans tended to riot. So Egypt became vital, not for its temples or its gods, but for its wheat. Rome, of course, also loved Egypt's aesthetic. The pyramids, the obelisks, the mummies, they were all exotic curiosities to collect and repurpose. Emperors shipped obelisks back to Rome to decorate circuses and forums, like very large lawn ornaments. They dragged statues, sphinxes, and chunks of temples across the Mediterranean.
Even today, if you wander through Rome, Paris, or London, you'll find Egyptian obelisks standing awkwardly in the middle of piazzas, like ancient souvenirs that never got returned. But let's step back a little. What was life actually like in Egypt under Roman rule? Well, for starters, Egypt was treated differently than other provinces. Augustus didn't want ambitious senators meddling in his new toy, so only the emperor himself could appoint Egypt's governor, usually a knight, not a senator. This meant Egypt was basically Augustus's private property. He owned it like a personal estate, with the sight of sphinxes. The governor of Egypt, called the prefect, wielded enormous power, but it came with a heavy job description: keep the grain flowing. As long as grain ships reached Rome on time, the prefect was safe. If they didn't, well, no one wanted to see Augustus angry. And while Rome controlled Egypt politically, the cultural blend kept simmering. Temples still operated, priests still performed rituals, Egyptians still worshipped Isis, Osiris, Horus, and the rest of their pantheon. But now Roman emperors started slipping into the role of pharaoh. Not in the old sense. They weren't doing daily rituals in Karnak. But on temple walls, you'd still see Augustus or Tiberius depicted in full pharaonic regalia, offering incense to Ra. It was a polite nod to tradition, a way of saying, yes, yes, we know you love your gods, carry on. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Egyptian religion was suddenly fashionable. The cult of Isis spread like wildfire. Roman matrons flocked to her temples. Priests of Isis paraded through the streets in elaborate processions, chanting and carrying sistrums. It was exotic, mystical, and just edgy enough to annoy traditional Roman conservatives. Because if there's one thing Roman elites hated, it was foreign cults distracting people from worshiping boring old Jupiter. Now, let's talk about the pyramids in this era. By the time Augustus arrived in Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Giza was already over 2,500 years old. To put that in perspective, Cleopatra lived closer in time to us than she did to the pyramid builders. For the Romans, the pyramids were already unfathomably ancient. Tourists flocked to them much like we do today. Graffiti carved by Roman visitors still survives inside the Great Pyramid. Little notes etched in Greek or Latin saying things like, "So-and-so is here," proof that history's first tourists were just as tacky as modern ones. Some emperors couldn't resist trying to one-up Egypt's wonders. Caligula, in one of his more flamboyant moods, reportedly wanted to dismantle the Great Pyramid and cart it back to Rome stone by stone. Fortunately, the logistics defeated him. Nero, always eager for drama, posed himself as a pharaoh in artistic depictions. Hadrian, emperor famous for building walls, actually toured Egypt in person. He and his companion, Antinous, floated down the Nile visiting temples and monuments like any wealthy traveler. After Antinous tragically drowned in the river, Hadrian declared him a god and built a city in his honor. Egypt, for the Romans, wasn't just grain, it was theater. Meanwhile, ordinary Egyptians carried on much as before. Farmers tilled the fields along the Nile, priests maintained their temples, craftsmen carved statues for Roman tourists, but life grew harder in some ways. Roman taxation was heavy, and uprisings occasionally broke out. Most were quickly crushed. Egypt was simply too valuable for Rome to lose. But over time, the old traditions began to fade. Temples declined as Christianity spread through the empire. By the 4th century CE, under emperors like Theodosius, pagan worship was officially outlawed. Temples were shuttered, priests vanished. The hieroglyphic script, once carved proudly into stone, fell into disuse. The last known hieroglyphic inscription dates to 394 CE. A small, sad epitaph for a language that had endured for 3 millennia. And yet, even as their culture dimmed, Egypt's monuments endured. The pyramids, temples, and colossal statues stood silently, too massive to erase. Travelers still came. Christian pilgrims, Byzantine officials, wandering monks all stared up at the pyramids in awe. They didn't understand them. They barely remembered who built them, but they knew they were old, mysterious, and impressive. Let's float back for a moment to one of the most quietly fascinating things about this era: the Roman habit of collecting mummies. Yes, collecting. Roman elites developed a taste for Egyptian mummies and even ground them up to use in medicine and potions. By late antiquity, the trade in mummies was brisk. Wrapped bodies pulled from the desert sands were shipped across the empire as curiosities. It's hard to imagine a more bizarre afterlife than being pulverized into a powder so some rich senator could sprinkle you into his wine. But that was Egypt under Rome, a land simultaneously sacred and commodified. The emperors honored its gods while looting its obelisks. Tourists admired its temples while scribbling graffiti on the walls. Priests clung to rituals while governors extracted grain. A contradiction, wrapped up nicely in desert sand. And maybe the most bittersweet part? For the Romans, Egypt's monuments were already ancient relics of a vanished golden age. They didn't know the pyramid builders' names. They couldn't read hieroglyphics. To them, the pyramids were as mysterious as they are to us today. They marveled, they speculated, they gossiped, but the truth of the Old Kingdom was already out of reach. History had folded in on itself, leaving behind stone and silence. So, as the sun sets on Roman Egypt, picture it. The Nile flowing endlessly, barges heavy with grain sailing north to feed Rome, while curious travelers carve their names into pyramid walls. Picture Augustus in Pharaoh's regalia, pretending to offer incense he didn't believe in. Picture Hadrian, grieving Antinous, staring into the Nile's waters and wondering if even gods could drown. It's quiet now. The temples are emptying, the chants of Isis fade into whispers, but the pyramids remain, unmoved, as they always have, watching, waiting, outlasting yet another empire that thought itself eternal. And with that thought, let's settle in. Because Egypt under Rome was less about glory, more about endurance. The land went on, the people went on, and the monuments, those patient piles of stone, simply kept standing, while the world around them shifted like sand.
So here we are. We've wandered with workers hauling limestone in the blazing sun. We've peeked inside chambers where pharaohs once lay, wrapped up like very expensive birthday presents. We floated through centuries of silence, when nobody really paid much attention to the pyramids, except perhaps the occasional shepherd or wandering mystic. Then we've stumbled into the modern rediscovery. Napoleon's sketchbooks, mummy parties, and Europeans dragging obelisks across oceans like decorative lawn ornaments. And yet, after all that, the pyramids are still here, still squatting in the desert, still doing their giant stone thing. That's the funny part. All this human drama, all the dynasties, the conquerors, the religions, the tourists with their scribbled journals, has come and gone. The pyramids just stayed, patient, immovable, watching the centuries pile up like so much drifting sand. Let's sit with that image for a bit. Imagine the Great Pyramid at night. The desert cools. The stars sprawl above in a sky so clear it almost hurts. At the base of the pyramid, sand whispers in the wind. No crowds, no archaeologists, just stone, silence, and time. That's been the backdrop for nearly 5,000 years. Empires rose, kings strutted, revolutions sparked, and the pyramid just kept standing, not particularly impressed. And humans, of course, can't resist attaching meaning to it. We've called it a tomb, a temple, a treasure vault, a star map, an alien landing pad, if you believe the fringe crowd. The truth is probably the most boring option. It's a monument, a very large, very expensive way of saying, look, I'm important. Don't forget me. Which is ironic, because almost every name etched into history has faded, while the stone pile itself remains. Take Khufu, the man behind the Great Pyramid. Once hailed as the big boss of Egypt, worshipped as a living god, remembered as a tyrant by some, a visionary by others. Today, most people couldn't tell you a single thing about him. They might not even remember his name. But his pyramid, everyone knows that. It's practically his only biography. Imagine being reduced to geometry. Not a king, not a story, just a giant triangle in the sand. That's legacy for you. And maybe that's why the pyramids still fascinate. They remind us how small we are compared to time. They're not romantic like castles. They're not cozy like ruins of temples in Greece. They're blunt, impersonal. Huge stone blocks stacked into a shape that doesn't care what you think. There's a kind of comfort in that. Of course, that hasn't stopped humans from fussing endlessly over them, measuring angles, debating construction techniques, speculating about secret chambers. Every few years, some new discovery pops up. Thermal scans hinting at voids inside, robots creeping down shafts, radar bouncing off hidden cavities. Each announcement sparks headlines about mysteries finally solved. And then, inevitably, it fizzles out, because the pyramids keep their secrets just tightly enough to stay interesting. And honestly, that's probably best. If everything about them were explained, they'd lose some of their sleepy allure. Imagine if we could prove beyond doubt how every stone was placed. Imagine if we mapped every corridor, labeled every block, reconstructed every ceremony. Would the pyramids still feel magical? Or would they just become a big construction project? A dusty spreadsheet of man-hours and limestone tonnage? Better perhaps to leave some mystery hanging in the air. Let's think too about the people who built them. Not just the pharaohs, not just the overseers with their whips and clipboards, but the thousands of ordinary workers. Men hauling ropes, women baking bread, children running errands, carrying water jars, probably rolling their eyes at their parents' complaints about back pain. We imagine pyramids as cold and silent, but in their making, they were full of noise. Singing, shouting, laughter, arguments, the mess of human life pressed into labor for a monument that none of them would ever really own. Those workers are long gone, their names forgotten, their bones scattered into the soil. And yet, their fingerprints are still hidden in the blocks. Literally. Some quarry marks, some scrawled graffiti still survive inside chambers that were never meant to be seen. Little jokes, team nicknames, proud signatures. The faintest whispers of the people behind the stone. Their pharaoh may be dust, but their doodles remain. That's kind of wonderful, isn't it? So as we wind down this long stroll through pyramid history, maybe the real story isn't just about kings and tombs. It's about endurance, about the persistence of stone versus the fragility of human life. The pyramids are older than Homer, older than the Bible, older than Stonehenge. They're practically older than the concept of history itself. And they'll probably still be there long after we're gone, staring blandly at the desert as our skyscrapers crumble and our satellites drift silently out of orbit. The pyramids are patient. That's their trick. They don't need to do anything. They don't need to speak. They just sit. And by doing nothing, they outlast everything. It's no wonder people project mystery onto them. We're not really looking at stone blocks when we stare at the pyramids. We're looking at ourselves, our fears of being forgotten, our desire for permanence, our absurd human urge to shout into eternity, "I was here!" Pharaohs did it with limestone. We do it with Instagram. Different tools, same instinct. And maybe, if you squint, the pyramids do whisper back. Not in hieroglyphs, not in secret codes, but in their sheer, stubborn existence. A quiet message that says, yes, you will vanish. Yes, your name will be forgotten. But something of you might endure. A work, a trace, a mark left behind. It won't last forever. Nothing does. But longer than you think. Long enough to matter. So, when you close your eyes tonight, drifting towards sleep, picture the pyramids under starlight. No tourists, no cameras, no chatter. Just ancient stone against the sky. Think about all the lives that came and went under their gaze. Think about how much time has passed. And then let that thought dissolve until it's just silence. The pyramids aren't going anywhere, and neither are you for the moment. So, rest.
So here we are.
We've wandered with workers hauling limestone in the blazing sun. We've peeked inside chambers where pharaohs once lay, wrapped up like very expensive birthday presents. We've floated through centuries of silence when nobody really paid much attention to the pyramids, except perhaps the occasional shepherd or wandering mystic. Then we've stumbled into the modern rediscovery, Napoleon's sketchbooks, mummy parties, and Europeans dragging obelisks across oceans like decorative lawn ornaments. And yet, after all that, the pyramids are still here, still squatting in the desert, still doing their giant stone thing. That's the funny part. All this human drama, all the dynasties, the conquerors, the religions, the tourists with their scribbled journals, has come and gone. The pyramids just stayed, patient, immovable, watching the centuries pile up like so much drifting sand. Let's sit with that image for a bit. Imagine the Great Pyramid at night. The desert cools, the stars sprawl above in a sky so clear it almost hurts. At the base of the pyramid, sand whispers in the wind. No crowds, no archaeologists, just stone, silence, and time. That's been the backdrop for nearly 5,000 years. Empires rose, kings strutted, revolutions sparked, and the pyramid just kept standing, not particularly impressed. And humans, of course, can't resist attaching meaning to it. We've called it a tomb, a temple, a treasure vault, a star map, an alien landing pad, if you believe the fringe crowd. The truth is probably the most boring option. It's a monument, a very large, very expensive way of saying, look, I'm important, don't forget me. Which is ironic, because almost every name etched into history has faded, while the stone pile itself remains. Take Khufu, the man behind the Great Pyramid. Once hailed as the big boss of Egypt, worshipped as a living god, remembered as a tyrant by some, a visionary by others, today, most people couldn't tell you a single thing about him. They might not even remember his name. But his pyramid? Everyone knows that. It's practically his only biography. Imagine being reduced to geometry. Not a king, not a story, just a giant triangle in the sand. That's legacy for you.
And maybe that's why the pyramids still fascinate. They remind us how small we are compared to time. They're not romantic like castles. They're not cozy like ruins of temples in Greece. They're blunt, impersonal, huge stone blocks stacked into a shape that doesn't care what you think. There's a kind of comfort in that. Of course, that hasn't stopped humans from fussing endlessly over them, measuring angles, debating construction techniques, speculating about secret chambers. Every few years, some new discovery pops up. Thermal scans hinting at voids inside, robots creeping down shafts, radar bouncing off hidden cavities. Each announcement sparks headlines about mysteries finally solved, and then, inevitably, it fizzles out because the pyramids keep their secrets just tightly enough to stay interesting. And honestly, that's probably best. If everything about them were explained, they'd lose some of their sleepy allure. Imagine if we could prove beyond doubt how every stone was placed. Imagine if we mapped every corridor, labeled every block, reconstructed every ceremony. Would the pyramids still feel magical? Or would they just become a big construction project? A dusty spreadsheet of man-hours and limestone tonnage? Better perhaps to leave some mystery hanging in the air. Let's think, too, about the people who built them. Not just the pharaohs, not just the overseers with their whips and clipboards, but the thousands of ordinary workers. Men hauling ropes, women baking bread, children running errands, carrying water jars, probably rolling their eyes at their parents' complaints about back pain. We imagine pyramids as cold and silent, but in their making, they were full of noise. Singing, shouting, laughter, arguments. The mess of human life pressed into labor for a monument that none of them would ever really own. Those workers are long gone. Their names forgotten, their bones scattered into the soil, and yet their fingerprints are still hidden in the blocks. Literally. Some quarry marks, some scrawled graffiti still survive in chambers that were never meant to be seen. Little jokes, team nicknames, proud signatures, the faintest whispers of the people behind the stone. Their pharaoh may be dust, but their doodles remain. That's kind of wonderful, isn't it? So as we wind down this long stroll through pyramid history, maybe the real story isn't just about kings and tombs. It's about endurance, about the persistence of stone versus the fragility of human life. The pyramids are older than Homer, older than the Bible, older than Stonehenge. They're practically older than the concept of history itself. And they'll probably still be there long after we're gone, staring blandly at the desert as our skyscrapers crumble and our satellites drift silently out of orbit. The pyramids are patient. That's their trick. They don't need to do anything. They don't need to speak. They just sit. And by doing nothing, they outlast everything. It's no wonder people project mystery onto them. We're not really looking at stone blocks when we stare at the pyramids. We're looking at ourselves, our fears of being forgotten, our desire for permanence, our absurd human urge to shout into eternity, "I was here!" Pharaohs did it with limestone. We do it with Instagram. Different tools, same instinct. And maybe if you squint, the pyramids do whisper back. Not in hieroglyphs, not in secret codes, but in their sheer stubborn existence. A quiet message that says, yes, you will vanish. Yes, your name will be forgotten. But something of you might endure. A work, a trace, a mark left behind. It won't last forever, nothing does, but longer than you think. Long enough to matter. So when you close your eyes tonight, drifting towards sleep, picture the pyramids under starlight. No tourists, no cameras, no chatter. Just ancient stone against the sky. Think about all the lives that came and went under their gaze. Think about how much time has passed. And then let that thought dissolve until it's just silence. The pyramids aren't going anywhere, and neither are you. For the moment. So rest.